Hello again, everyone. It's great to see you. We are, believe it or not, in week number 20 of our sermon series. I don't know if you'd ever thought you'd be in a 20-week-long plus sermon series, but let's do a little recalibration about why we're even doing this. We're doing a slow walk through the Gospel of Mark because it's frankly all about Jesus. And we want to be a church that is formed by the life of Jesus and the ways of Jesus and the character of Jesus and the practices of Jesus. So we're sort of unapologetically doing a deep dive on the life of Jesus. And I'm still having fun. I hope you are too. In the next couple of weeks, we'll take a pause and we'll do a couple of week approach to Easter. And then we'll probably have another little subtle shift away from Mark for a few weeks after Easter, and then we will get back in for the spring and the summertime. This is a passage where it's helpful to give some context, because as we've said over and over, the Gospel of Mark is fluid and it moves fast. So today we begin in verse 30, but first we're going to look at a couple of preceding verses. At the end, or at the beginning of chapter 1, in the beginning of chapter 6, the first story ended in verses 12 and 13, where Jesus sent out the disciples to preach and to cast out demons and to heal people. So it was the first time Jesus commissioned the disciples to get out there in public and do the stuff that he was doing. And then there was an abrupt transition last week to this side story about King Herod in this party that he threw and how John the Baptist ended up dead. And it was a very awkward and strange story, and we framed it last week. So if you missed that context, I'd encourage you to go back and watch or listen to last week. It was pretty lighthearted, pretty easy listening, non-controversial at all. So you should get through it in just a few minutes. The laughs betray what really went on, I think. So here we are. We're in verse 30. The disciples went out, and now they're coming back. That story was just sort of a side story. The disciples are coming back, and here's the first interesting thing that the text reveals. Verse 30 says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. And this is the first time in the book where the disciples are referenced as apostles. At no time were they given this designation or this title of apostles. An apostle is someone who is sent out. We tend to think of it just in terms of the 12 apostles, but to be apostolic is to be sent out for a mission. It goes hand in hand with the idea of being a missionaries. And the writer uses this term not when they go out, but when they come back, because they did the apostolic thing. They went out and preached Jesus and prayed for people and addressed spiritual warfare. So now there's a clue about what the church community is going to be like. It's going to be an apostolic church community that does the works that Jesus does. So anyhow, that's a note, but the story unfolds here. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So whatever the disciples did, it stirred up some interest. People wanted more. They wanted to be now not just around Jesus, but they wanted to see what these disciples were up to. So they came and they kept bothering them. They kept coming, and the disciples didn't even get a chance to eat. And as Jesus so often does, he says, you've worked really hard. Now it's time to slow down. Now it's time to rest. So he invites them to a quiet place. And the underlying idea of this quiet place, this word is going to get repeated 3 times in this passage. So it's important to know what Jesus is doing with this vocabulary. He's using the word for wilderness or desert or a lonely place. He's using the word that the Israelite people would recollect and connect to 40 years in the wilderness. They would connect it to the story of Moses and Joshua and the Israelites and the people of God's historical struggle in the desert. So if you were informed by that Old Testament narrative about God's people, and you were around Jesus, and Jesus says, hey, slow down, let's relax, let's get something to eat, come out to the desert with me. You would probably go, wait a minute, Jesus. The desert isn't where we go and hang out and rest. The desert isn't the place where we're at leisure. The desert is the place where we struggle. The wilderness is the place that we got lost. Why would you be inviting us to go out into the wild where there's conflict, where there's danger, where there's isolation? Jesus, that doesn't make any sense. We would rather be in town where we could go and buy food and sleep at an inn or something like that. And here's sort of the theme, I think, that is going to unfold, and it's an invitation that I would like for you to be holding for the remainder of our time together. Here it is. With Jesus, there can be rest in the wild. With Jesus, there can be rest in the wild. Now, I'm someone, you've heard me talk about how I love retreats. I love getting away. I love to be in isolated places. I love downtime, alone time, taking naps, and reading. That's what I love. I like to be alone with God from time to time so I can focus without distraction, and I love it, and it's wonderful. And it sounds super spiritual, which is dangerous and dumb because it gives you an inflated sense of all sorts of dangerous stuff. Anyhow, here's the thing, though. For as much as I would encourage a retreat, get alone, take a couple days, couple nights, take off of work, take a break from your responsibilities, not everyone can just do that. And I get that. Like there's sacrifice involved, but even calling it sacrifice doesn't mean everyone is just able to do that. Like not everyone is just able to stop being a parent to get away. Not everyone is able just to hit pause and stop being a caregiver to a relative to get away and practice spirituality in a log cabin somewhere. Not everyone can just take off from school, take off of work. Not everyone can just miss 2 or 3 days of work and think they're still going to make rent or have food in the kitchen. So I sort of want to encourage these good and healthy practices while also admitting that there is an element, dare I say, of privilege to being able to have the space and the resources to practice these things. So if you're someone who is not able to practice these things, for example, if you were an ancient Israelite in captivity in Egypt, kind of hard to get away to be spiritual, right? Let's take it even a step further. If you were on the ground floor of God's work among enslaved Africans in this country, and you were on the ground floor of what would become the rich and deep heritage of the African American church in this country, you didn't get away to learn how to be with Jesus. Many, dare I say, most believers who have practiced deep, rich spirituality with Jesus did it under conflict and in stress. So it is one thing to say, if you can do it, make that time. Take off, sacrifice food, comfort, sleep, money, and be with God. There's nothing else like that. Do it if you can. But if you can't, Jesus will be with you in the stress, in captivity, in the desert, and in the wilderness. And you won't miss a thing. He promises this. This is what the promise of his presence is like. Not all of us can get away, but Jesus makes it so that we can be with him in the wild. There's an old, I don't know if it's a genuine story or a myth about the wife of a well-known preacher in the early 18th or 19th century. It might have been like a Jonathan Edwards or a John Wesley. One of you might be able to corroborate this story with me after the service. But I remember the story of the wife was at home while the husband was out ministering, traveling, and a bunch of kids in the house, 7, 8, 9 kids, and can't get away, can't just hang out with Jesus. So mom figured out that I'm going to have my quiet time. No one's going to distract me from my Jesus time. I'm going to get it however I need to get it. So, hey kids, when the blanket goes over my head at the kitchen table, you better be quiet. The blanket goes over the head, and it's mom in Jesus time. And there would be some wrath to pay, I think if I remember the story right, if that time was interrupted. But that is a creative way to find Jesus in the wild. Jesus' invitation to the disciples is to get away to the wilderness, because the wilderness is not comfortable, but that's where the presence of Jesus will be. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Verse 32. Solitary is the same word that was just used for quiet, also having the connotation of wilderness. But many who saw them recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. His heart was for the disciples, that they had worked really hard. People were asking a lot of them. They needed a break. They needed to get away. But the crowd wouldn't let that happen. So when the crowd shows up, Jesus' gaze shifts from the disciples to the crowds. And because it's Jesus, the response is just heartening. He's not annoyed by the crowds. He's not overwhelmed by the crowds. He's not mad at the crowds for showing up where they weren't invited. His response is compassion. His response is to offer of himself, to take time to speak with them, to be with them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. There's historical references all over the place, and we'll look at two here that clearly refer to the story of the ancient Israelites. Here's a quick one out of Numbers chapter 27. This is at the end of Moses' life. Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Moses was at the end of his life. He said, God, someone's got to come next after me so the people are cared for. And Joshua was risen up. Similar sentiment here in Ezekiel, different tone. Catch the tone shift here. Ezekiel says, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. So 2 takes of being like sheep without a shepherd. One that is merciful and empathetic and compassionate, and the other one that is harsh because the people are hurting. So when the crowds show up, again, Jesus isn't mad, angry, annoyed, distraught. Compassion. God's people looking for a way forward, stumbling over themselves. Of course, I'm going to give them the time that they need. The wilderness is interesting and awful and beautiful and inspiring and dangerous. Or however familiar you are with the wild, with hiking, camping, foresting, traveling, adventuring, you know the wild can be safe and restful and refreshing if you have a shepherd guiding you. But if not, it'll kill you. You'll die. If you're out in a solitary place and you're not equipped, food, clothing, water, shelter, and a really helpful guide, at least to get you started, you'll die. And if you have a corrupt guide, you'll really die. The wild will kill you, but it can also renew you. I had my first sort of grand sense of this about 7 or 8 years ago. I was never much of a camper, adventurer growing up. My first big, long overseas adventure was when Jen and I got to visit the Middle East in 2014. And part of that adventure was to do an overnight in the desert of Jordan with some local guides hanging out with the shepherds. And it was amazing. And here's just one picture of the scale of some of those rocks and mountains, and then to see how the goats can climb those things and not fall. It was just awe-inspiring. But you see the group of us, how little we are, and the desert just unfolded. And by the time it was nighttime, it was freezing, and we were hungry. And if we didn't have people guiding us, like if they took off and was like, we're going to go home now, we got your money, I would have died. Jen would have made it. She knows how to do that stuff. I would have died. The scale of trying to survive in the desert was too big. Not to mention, in the daytime, it was just a little warm. Here was just I had to take a screenshot of the temperature in Aqaba. It was 109 on one of our hiking days. No big deal. I did maybe my favorite hike ever that day, and it was beautiful and it was refreshing, but it could have killed me if I didn't have a guide. So Jesus inviting the disciples into the wilderness to be a guide that will give them rest in a dangerous place. Verse 35, by this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. Jesus is showing compassion. The disciples are they're kind of ready to move on. This is a remote, same word as quiet, same word as solitary. This is a wilderness place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Jesus, they're like sheep without a shepherd. I'm going to show them compassion and teach them. The disciples, get him out of here. I'm hungry. It's very late. Send them away to use their own resources, by the way. Verse 37, but he answered, you give them something to eat. As I've been prepping for sermons lately, I read, but I also try to listen. And when I listen to this passage, I listen to it read by a British fellow. And this phrase just hit a little differently coming from a Brit, but he answered, you give them something to eat. Like you could see the sneer and the snarl in your mind's eye. I just appreciated he brought that to Jesus' response. You give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have, he asked. Go and see. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. When they found out how much food they had, they said 5 loaves and 2 fish. You give them something. Sometimes we can get overwhelmed by people's needs, right? It's easy to not feel the weight of people who have maybe just a little bit less than we do. It's also easy to get overwhelmed with our own needs. It's just hard to be needy. Sometimes when we get overwhelmed with our own needs, and especially with other people's needs, we can tend to ask too much of them. Send them away. It's getting dark. It's getting late. Send them away. Make them buy their own dinner. Like, Jesus, you've been teaching them for free. The least they can do is provide for themselves. Send them away to buy stuff. Well, maybe they could have. Some of them. In a group that big, probably not all of them, though. Just tell them to get a job. Just tell them to get a job. Like, what's so difficult about that? Well, a lot. There's sickness and illness and confusion and depression and anxiety and roadblocks and bills and just trying to make it. And do I leave my kids home and work because if I pay the sitter, it's just going to cancel out what I make anyway, so why even bother going to work if I have to pay the sitter? I'm not going to have any food to feed my kids anyway. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we ask too much of people before knowing their story. When knowing their story, that's something different because people can be challenged. But it was a broad demand to a broad group of people. And Jesus, again, he doesn't respond harshly to the disciples' harshness. He makes another invitation. How many loaves do you have? Jesus invites the disciples to look inward. We might rephrase it like this. How many loaves do you have? What are the resources that are already available to you? Look inward. Look at your own life. Don't worry about them doing things. Don't worry that you don't have enough. I know you don't have enough to cover 5,000 people. But what are the resources that are already available to you? Because you take inventory of the resources that are available to you, Jesus might be able to do something with those few resources that you could have never imagined doing on your own. So that was the invitation. Look inward. What do you have to offer? I know what you can't offer, but what can you offer? So taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. After looking inward at their available resources and giving them over to Jesus, the disciples didn't feed the crowd. The disciples offered their resources to Jesus to do what he wanted to do with them. And not only was the crowd fed, but the disciples had more for themselves than what they started with. That's the difference between trying to meet unmanageable needs by yourself with limited resources versus offering resources to Jesus and saying, you know best, I can't help everyone, but this is what I have. What can you do with this? Maybe that's a word to one of you in a specific way this morning. The disciples were provided for. The crowd was provided for. Nobody's cranky anymore. That's important because there's yet another swift transition here in verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. There is a place for being interrupted. There is a place for saying, I was going to have my time. I had my time set aside. I was going to be with God. I was going to be refreshed. And to have people's needs interrupt that, and then attend to those needs, there's a place for that. But when that happens, just know that Jesus is going to double down on you getting your time. Because you cannot exist in a perpetual state of meeting other people's needs. You might be able to selflessly step into that moment that you didn't expect to and give of your limited resources when you weren't expecting to. But then Jesus is going to make you slow down. And if you don't listen to that sort of a little more stern perspective of Jesus, a little more heavy-handed, like, okay, you were ready to slow down, but then you served, now it's non-negotiable. He made his disciples get into the boat while he dismissed the crowd. It's time beyond time to slow down. And Jesus is going to model it first, like he always does. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Jesus models rest, interruption, and rest on the other side of interruption. Jesus models real life. And he modeled it all in the wilderness. Come with me into the dangerous place. Come with me into the chaos. Come with me into the place that reminds you of the worst part of your story. Because you can't get away to the mansion or to the retreat center or to the cabin in the woods. You can't. Your own life is the classroom. So get away with me in the midst of chaos, and I'll be with you. And I'll use your resources in a way you couldn't imagine using your own resources. And I will give you rest. This idea of our own lives and our own environments as a classroom was introduced to me almost 20 years ago by one of my first mentors, Joe. Joe showed up here about 4 or 5 months ago. That was probably closer to a year ago now. And I was sitting with Joe, and we were chatting, and I was complaining about something that 20-year-olds complain about. I can't remember what it was. And Joe just sort of said to me, "Sean, you're in class. And the bell hasn't rung yet." Like, that's so cheesy. And true. I don't like it. But I've learned that over the centuries, so many spiritual leaders, so many people who've written and lived out and experienced a prayerful life have talked about being formed in the context of their own lives, of their own hardships, of their own stress, of their own captivity. That's the wilderness for most of us. And that's where Jesus wants to teach us and grow us. So if we propose this imagery, if the wilderness is a classroom, if the stress and the chaos and the burdens of your own life is the classroom, what lesson are you learning from Jesus? Are you learning to find your rest in Him in the way that only He can give it? Are you learning to trust His provision that, yes, you can serve, and yes, you can help meet other people's needs, but it's really about surrendering those resources to Him and letting Him fill in those gaps so you don't have to do it all for everybody? Is it becoming secure with your needs and the needs of others? Sometimes just being around a need can bring out a harshness in us or an insecurity in us, or I barely have my life together. How can I help anybody else? And with Jesus, like the disciples, we move from that insecure place of, send them away. Jesus, I just want you. To, no, I can be with them and I could use resources and I'm okay because Jesus is with me in my wilderness. So we'll close here and I'll give you just another 30 seconds or so of silent reflection. And maybe one of these questions will pop into your mind. It'll land a little more than the other ones. And you and the Lord can dialogue about that in these next few seconds. Jesus, no matter the chaos that swirls around us, in you we are secure. No matter how much we sense that we lack in terms of tangible resources, in you we can trust for provision. And Lord, whatever other needs are out there that make us feel insecure or unhelpful to others or overwhelmed, with you, we can use our resources for the good of exactly the reason you're calling us to use them, and no more than that. So Jesus, this morning, would you help us find true security in our identity as daughters and sons? Lord, some of us have bread and fish to offer you to turn into more. Some of us have a harsh or critical spirit towards others that you are gently poking and prodding and asking us to release. Some of us are just feeling distant, like you're quiet. And Lord, you're asking us to just turn towards you and look and listen to your invitation to come with you in the wilderness of our lives. So Lord, help us to be obedient to the specific thing you are saying to us this morning through your word. Help us to be obedient to it, to attend to it. Lord, as we do, give us a joyful and expectant spirit, and may that begin to bubble up right now as we close by singing your praise. In your name we pray.